Hey everybody, welcome to the Sustainability Motion podcast brought to you by ED4S. We focus on the fast-moving sustainability world to help the business community better understand the sustainability and environmental challenges we face. I'm Matt Orsagh, Chief Content Officer at ED4S.
Hi everyone, I'm Maisuradze, founder and CEO at ED4S and a big fan of the 21st Century Investing book. And we're super excited to have the author of this book today. Just quick intro to say I had one of my multiple aha moments reading this book, so highly recommend to you guys.
Well, Maria stole the headline. Today we're talking with Bill Burckart, CEO at the Investment Integration Project, which helps investors integrate more systems thinking into their investment process. Bill's been at the forefront of the ESG and impact investing community and has worked as an advisor to investment management firms, private foundations, nonprofits, government, and major financial services industries. And as Maria said, he's co-author of the recent book, 21st Century Investing, which we'll be talking about today. Bill, thanks for joining us.
Really a pleasure to be here, Matt and Maria.
All right, let's get into things. You and Steve Leidenberg co-founded TIIP over a decade ago to better integrate systems thinking into the investment process. For the uninitiated, give us an introduction of what systems level thinking is and how it applies to investing.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a great starting point. So system level investing essentially focuses on managing those interactions within and between financial, economic, environmental, social systems and how their influence is on investment risks and returns. So think about it from the perspective of you are still deploying investment strategies, you're still thinking about asset allocation, portfolio construction, all of that. But you're doing so with the lens of actually mitigating a lot of undesirable outcomes at the root, as opposed to simply dealing with them once they become big issues. And so this kind of approach, it requires a lot of adapting or otherwise adopting all sorts of, traditional, conventional investment techniques that we're all familiar with, as well as essentially embracing a number of other techniques and tools that help to foster collaboration, shared knowledge, industry standards, and diverse investment opportunities. And I would say the additional aspect to it is that the investors are going that extra mile and saying, okay, given the kind of investor I am, with the kind of focus that I have, we're going to target key leverage points that ultimately strengthen these systems, enhance their resilience, and promote long-term sustainability. So a more simple way of saying it is that if you think about investment traditionally or historically, it starts with, it's individual stocks, individual companies that you're investing in, approved lists, all of that. Then modern portfolio theory, you're managing a basket of stocks. Now with the systems level focus, you're really trying to manage the context within which these stocks exist. And that's probably at a high level, that is system level investing.
Bill, when I was reading the book, I was much aware of sustainable investing and impact investing. And what I really love is that you really clearly outline the difference between traditional investing, impact investing, sustainable investing, and then taking it all the way to systems level investing. And when you read it, it really makes a lot of sense. And then we're talking about bringing this to life in a practical way. And some of the examples I saw actually got very excited about too was CDPQ, which is a company I used to work with. And I remember when they announced the electric train system, that was a big moment. I'm not sure if they were really realizing the systems change that investment could have had. So could you please tell me, when you work with your clients and you're trying to bring the system level lens, strategy, and policy to them, how do they define the business case for it? What's their aha moment? How to go about it, explaining it for them and selling it to them?
Yeah, well, it depends on the investor type, right? So it's a great question. So when we think of these big systems and we think of the systemic issues that will manifest when these systems are under stress, what we're fundamentally talking about is intergenerational risk. And the moment that you frame it in terms of intergenerational risk, because you're talking about climate change, you're talking about income inequality, racial inequity, that these are things that have built up over millennia, and to ultimately start to address them, depending on the investor that you are. So if you're a fiduciary and you're thinking about, well, how do I justify this focus? Why is this something that's useful for us? You could look at another Canadian pension, university pension plan, joint sponsored pension plan based in Ontario. And they literally have their kind of investment beliefs that basically say, like every pension, to make good on our pension promise to our beneficiaries, we do X. Well, they're taking it that additional step and saying, to make good on our pension promise to our beneficiaries, we have to manage the climate change, right? We have to manage that climate risk because ultimately we know that this is relevant, that we have exposure to these big systemic issues, and that it's otherwise going to influence our ability to fulfill that promise. And so when you're managing your timeline is 75 years from now to pay out certain beneficiaries, you have to think about how a changing climate is going to affect just health generally, right? You have to think about mobility issues with social unrest, a big key aspect of that, thinking about how it's disproportionately influencing certain segments of the population, whether around the world or within your own backyard. And so it's like with these systemic issues, it's always trying to like understand, like, how do you tie it into that overarching purpose of that institution? So ultimately then find the justification. If you are a foundation, you in theory operate in perpetuity. So you're thinking about generations, right? And so when you think about that, you think about these big systemic issues and your ability to ultimately influence them. If you take that longer view, if you take that more complex view, it then invites a reconsideration of your policies, programs, and practices. And then if you think about making the case for advisors or consultants or managers, I mean, at the end of the day, particularly for advisors and consultants, it fundamentally comes down to client recruitment and client retention. And with more asset owners acknowledging that systemic risks are going to be something that they have to now manage. If you guys have seen any of the research that's come out by Roger Irwin of the Thinking Ahead Institute, and it was just some really interesting data that came out where they're basically saying, like, they surveyed these massive asset owners from around the world, and all of them say, I think it was like 80-something% were like, we know we are going to grapple with these big systemic risks more and more, and we have to get smarter about how we manage that kind of complexity. So depending on the investor type that you are, you'll have a different motivation or justification for why you do it. But at the end of the day, what we're basically saying is like, look, there are these societal systems, and you think about human dignity or fairness or the rule of law, things like that. There are environmental systems like water and minerals and the atmosphere, and financial systems around transparency and how capital flows around the world. All of these things investors rely on to drive returns, but also help to facilitate global prosperity. And so the more that people start to understand the kind of complexity of these systems, it invites a reconsideration of how they show up to ultimately deploy this capital and generate the kinds of outcomes that they need to generate.
So Bill, I understand for asset owners, so pension funds, foundation, it really makes sense because they're almost like universal owners. They can't diversify those systemic risks away. And now they come to selecting their potential external asset managers. And asset managers, typically, they're being evaluated on their track record, right? So really performance, and what asset owners look at is those quarterly or annual returns. How do you see this practice of assessing and selecting asset managers changed as the asset owners now realize that they need to manage for those systemic risks?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, great question. So in a couple of ways it's changed. So in the same way that as asset owners go in this direction, they're having to think about that justification, right? Like how have we determined that this is the systemic issue that we should be focused on? They're trying to walk that through all of their policies, programs, and practices, and then be able to speak about, well, what progress was achieved? Like what for that we did all this? All of those same kind of expectations that asset owners are now starting to reflect out into the market, increasingly, that is the kind of benchmarks that asset managers in particular are going to be measured against. So think about it from, it's not just a company level analysis or a fund level analysis. Now we're talking about a firm level analysis. So you're trying to understand what is the consistency with which this kind of thinking has been applied or teased out. You're looking at, have they gone through the process of justifying that focus? Do they have a unique systemic issue that they want to focus on? Is there a real rationale for the constraints they put on it? All of these things start to really come into play. And what's been fascinating, and as one of the things that we do as consultants is we run these advisor searches. And one of the fascinating things that I've always found is that, you issue an RFP on behalf of some asset owner that's looking for new support, and you maybe get 50 applications back. And what's fascinating is for the managers and the advisors that get it right, like everybody does Monte Carlo financial modeling. Everybody, like 90% of these things look like and smell and taste the same, right? What's fascinating though, while all of them do the macroeconomic forecasting about these big mega trends that are going to influence performance and stability and all of the things, they'll have the thing that distinguishes them, which is how they think about sustainable impact and responsible investment and increasingly system level considerations. What's fascinating to me is that like those that connect the macroeconomic forecasts with their sustainable and impact, that's getting them closer to a system level. And that's the kind of stuff that asset owners, particularly the smart ones, the ones that are getting more familiar about all this, are starting to recognize. And so you're seeing that beginning to play out in certain decisions. You're certainly starting to see that with the big institutions that have walked back some of their commitments on some of the bigger, broader Climate Action 100 plus, net zero, all of that. So it's definitely the expectation and standard is changing, and it's one of those things where it's the comprehensiveness, it's the clarity of what they're doing, the confidence in which they're doing it, the conviction that they're doing it. All of those things are now playing into it. And for any manager that is starting and stopping at like, well, we can draw a vague alignment with one of these big goals, these SDGs or net zero or whatever, but without really backing it up with new thought that can show and demonstrate that they're improving and deepening that commitment, that's where they're going to get dinged increasingly. And because it becomes such an increasingly important factor that asset owners are having to grapple with.
Really interesting. So a way to really stand out from the crowd when you're applying for those RFPs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the other just little nuance here is to say, I'm making the case from the perspective that most managers and advisors and consultants really speak in, which is recruitment and retention. Does it generate more capital flowing to you? Does it increase the size of your book of business? But at the end of the day, these managers should want to manage this stuff because these systemic risks are not only affecting asset owners, right? Like they are affecting the managers. They're affecting the people that are advising on or otherwise managing this capital. And so it behooves them to start thinking in this way. It's just the market is still catching up. The infrastructure is still catching up for them to be able to model it and really integrate it most fully. But like the direction of travel is pretty clear. And I know you guys had John McCormick on, and he's involved in something with Jim Hawley called Aaron, which is looking at how do you begin to model externalities, like all of that. I mean, the puck is moving pretty fast.
Yeah. That gets us to another question I wanted to ask. In systems thinking is a new way of thinking for a lot of people in our industry. And I think this is the third time we've talked about systems level thinking and recommend again Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems is kind of the starting point for a lot of this and the work you guys are doing as well. But what I really like about what TIIP is doing and has been doing is it tells people how to do this, because it's great to put out a very shiny ivory tower white paper about you should think in systems and then just walk away. And people are left, oh, well, that sounds good, but how do I do that? That's something TIIP does a great job. You can see it in the book, 21st Century Investing, but also see what TIIP does. Can you walk us through a little bit of the process, the steps in the process to give away just a little bit of the secret sauce of how you guys do this?
Yeah, no, and I appreciate you saying that because it's an interesting thing. When Jim and John were writing Moving Beyond Modern Portfolio Theory, Steve and I were writing 21st Century Investing. And the whole idea was that we were intentional about these things coming out at basically the same time. They were released within a month of each other. And if Jim and John's book really, that's the thing about system level investing that's also different from, I would say, sustainable or impact investing. It's fundamentally grounded in financial theory, which is why I think it's caught on and resonated with so many institutional investors, particularly CIOs. And that's been something that I think is unique. And it's, when we talk about it, it's not like, oh, you're a system level investor because you launch a fund that is just doing some interesting investments, but it's not being applied across everything you do. So for us, when we think about our starting point is always around that deciding where to focus. So you've come to some acknowledgement or awareness that there is a difference between idiosyncratic risk and systemic risk. And right now, all the tools at your disposal are essentially only helping you manage one of those, which is the idiosyncratic risk. So part of what we do when we start to have these conversations is to basically start to go through, oftentimes investment beliefs tend to be the like gateway drug, as it were. And And it's really an opportunity to get leadership and to get buy-in across multiple levels within an institution to ultimately inform something that is going to require a commitment by the entire institution. So that becomes part of this process. And so it's really starting to understand and help discern, is there real consensus? Like, is there a real authoritative source or sources, whether it's economists, other investors, scientists, basically like, yes, climate change is an actual thing. It is going to disrupt things. It's potentially the insurance industry is going to run out of things to insure, right? Like, this is a real thing. Then you get into, okay, well, how is that actually relevant to us? And so if you look at an example like Domini Impact Investments, they've done a lot of work combating biodiversity loss and climate change through the lens of deforestation. And so for them, it was very much they could go through their assets and they could see how exposed they were to deforestation and some of those the bigger outcomes that result from it. So they could really confirm that this was relevant to their work. Same thing, you get into the next part, which is like, can they actually effectively do something? And it's interesting, we've done a lot of work around income inequality, and that effectiveness question takes different shapes depending on the type of investor. So when we started the income inequality work, we were primarily working with institutional investors. We were doing it in collaboration with UNPRI. And so a lot of the recommendations that we had in that were reflected in the book were really around, if you're an institutional investor, primarily operating through public markets, what do you do? What are those key leverage points? What are those things that you can really have a disproportionate influence on? And so we talked about things like labor and workers' rights to the value chains. We talked about executive compensation. We talked about tax and tax avoidance and how, like, you know, if you're rewarding companies in the market for avoiding paying taxes, you are stealing resources from government that is responsible for creating the stable operating environment for those investments to thrive in. And so it's like helping people kind of understand that is a huge part of it. And then there's the uncertainty question. And so the uncertainty question really goes into the scenario analysis. Like TCFD was like a big, obviously proponent of that. But you can really do it for a lot of issues where thinking through, we don't quite know how fast the polar ice caps are going to melt. We don't quite know what that is going to do in terms of issues around social instability. We don't know what that's going to then result in terms of different industries being able to still function normally and all of that. And so because of that, it does require us thinking in terms of scenarios. It requires us to think in terms of, well, if it goes this fast, if it goes that fast, if this changes, the innovation. And then the idea is that you're pulling that through. And you're basically saying, okay, what are those things around asset allocation or around manager selection or around corporate engagement, things like that? How can we start to enhance those? And so that leads me into like one of the big buckets of system level approaches, which is around investment enhancement. And so it's basically just saying you're not just focusing on applying that in the context of a specific company or a fund or a portfolio. You're really trying to understand, how do those actions then ultimately influence change at an industry or sector level? And then understanding, and then how does that kind of, by getting a groundswell of the key actors or multiple actors within the financial system, how does that actually result in changes to the actual systems in consideration? So all of that, the investment enhancement, is essentially changing how investors invest. Two other big buckets that we talk about of activities that we've now seen a number of investors are doing is around opportunity generation. So opportunity generation basically means they're changing what investors invest in, or they're layering in additional considerations. So you could have a situation like with asset allocation, where they're really looking at the utility of an asset class. How does that asset class really influence societal priorities or environmental priorities? So something like venture capital, private equity, really great for driving kind of disruptive, revolutionary change. Fixed income, when issued by municipalities, really great for generating public goods. Public equities for transparency in markets, incremental change in big companies. The idea being, though, is that you're now adding that lens into this. And we've seen some really interesting stuff that Cambridge Associates has done, where they, particularly with some of their nature and climate recommendations, where they're not saying, hey, don't consider the purpose of these in terms of inflation protection or growth or whatever. They're layering in what the function of that asset class is, and then they're providing examples of what that would look like in practice. So it's all of these things start to come together in a way that really changes what investors are ultimately allocating capital to, but also doing things that help cultivate the ecosystem. And then finally, they're thinking about changing the way that investors collaborate. And this is where we get into field building. So you would see something like, go back a few years ago, water as a systemic risk was not something that, you go back 10, 15 years ago, the data, the opportunities, the strategies, all that was fairly limited. Then you have the creation of something like what Ceres did with the Investor Water Hub. And all of a sudden, the data, the know-how, the opportunities, all these things start to come together in a meaningful way to drive more awareness and interest in doing that kind of investing. So fundamentally, when you think about, and I've glossed over a ton of the techniques, but at a very high level, it's investment enhancement. So you're changing the way you invest and act. Opportunity generation, you're changing what you invest in. And then ultimately field building, which is changing how you collaborate. And that's how investors can start to drive more of that resiliency in both with other investors, but then also in these systems.
No, that's a great summary. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, and I thought really interesting to learn about different asset classes as well. Like I didn't realize cash could actually have an impact. There's so much cash lying around, and the selection of that institution where it flows to does make an impact. So for me, that was another eye opener from the book. So building upon that, like we talk about like big systemic things, income inequality, and like some of the fascinating things for me is like, why would an investor tell the investee company to pay more taxes or pay more salaries to the employees, and by that basically reducing profit? So a lot of these things like don't really make sense in the classical financial world in the way we're kind of being trained to like optimize for the short term and maximize profits. So could you tell us an example that really drives this home to make it very concrete for the listeners on how could this look in real life, from that philosophy or selecting that specific focus area all the way to executing and maybe eventually even tracking and measuring that impact?
Great question. So I think, let me go back to the Domini example, if that's useful. So when Domini first started, now, mind you, because of the unique relationship between my co-founder, Steve Leidenberg, and Domini, which he also co-founded and is a partner there, we were able to test out a lot of our thinking and our approaches and all of that. Domini was really patient with us in allowing us to do that. And one of the things that, and they've been public and they've shared a lot of their lessons learned as they've gone down this process, but they did the thing that we see a lot of investors do. They get really excited about this. And so when Domini has written about this in some of their reports about how they started out, they had 8 different teams internally. These 8 different teams were looking at all these different systemic issues. And so over the course of like 18 months to 2 years, they were trying to explore all these to try to figure out, as an institution, how can we most effectively begin to influence all of these different issues? Well, at the end of the 2 years, one of the big insights or aha moments for them, speaking of aha moments, was just that idea saying, look, if we're going to really truly tackle a big systemic issue, we've got to narrow that focus. And because part of their kind of ethos was around environmental resilience, it made sense for them to go in that direction, at least initially. And so they were looking at, well, we're thinking about climate change at a really high level, biodiversity loss, all of these things, and then really being able to narrow it down based on, yet again, that criteria. This is how it's relevant to us, and this is how it's showing up. This is how we can most effectively, because of the style of investments that we're doing, because the unique focus of whether it's regional or global or whatever. So being able to think that through and apply it helped them essentially narrow that lens to something that was super concrete and that they could really begin to build an entire program around. And so as they go through each of the different steps, it invited opportunities for different kinds of engagements, thinking about engaging entire sectors, not just individual companies, right? They're thinking about how they begin to evaluate progress and how they begin to build coalitions, acknowledging that despite the fact that they're a 2 billion, maybe more manager, it's the acknowledgement of saying, like, even if you're the biggest investor in the world, you can't single-handedly solve climate change. And so you have to really begin to build that groundswell of awareness and action by other investors in the financial community. And so they go through that process where they're starting to establish the Nature Action 100 plus, the variation of it, so that they can start to galvanize other investors to be able to come along. They're influencing policy, writing letters to the SEC, doing things that are really thinking about the structural policy regulatory environment to otherwise, create that enabling environment for more of this. And then ultimately, they're thinking about, okay, from the types of goals that they ultimately set, like what is a systemic goal versus a portfolio goal, and how is that different? And really contemplating, at the end of the day, when they talk about deforestation, they're really talking about global land use and how there's only so much land to go around, right? And so when you think about it, it's like there's a small percentage of the world that is actually land that can be used. A lot of it's just, it's barren land. It's not going to be cultivated. You're able to do these things where they look all the way down, and then they can see look, at the end of the day, the goals that we set, there's a reality that comes with that. And that reality is, with only so much land in the world, you either are we preserving more land to help with addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, or because the population is exploding on the planet, are we cultivating more land so we can feed more people? You pull from one, it's the string, it's pulling from the other, right? And so part of the conclusions that they've discovered is around look, the business models of the future are going to have this combination of value extraction, value preservation, and value creation. And we have to get comfortable with walking on all 3 feet, legs of the stool. You get the metaphor. But it's that, right? And then we can talk a little bit more about evaluating progress, but that's the thing that it continues to be the thing that, we've done lots of case studies. It's always that aspect that is the least addressed at the moment, because understanding, the way that we as sustainable and impact investors think, we think in terms of contribution, we think in terms of attribution, we think in terms of ways that our current infrastructure and insights don't necessarily get us to that system level just yet, but we're experimenting with a lot of frameworks and approaches.
You raise an interesting question. How do you measure, and I don't want to take too long on this because we have one more question to ask, but that makes me think, how do you measure progress towards that? How do investors who have, quarterly goals and yearly goals, and these systems we're talking about changing are decades in changing, how do you measure that progress?
Good question, Matt. So we have really focused on making this distinction between, just integrating ESG characteristics for risk management, as well as thinking through just measuring impact, right? We've introduced, and a number of folks have really taken it to a whole other level, just this whole idea of influence. Is the basic idea being that, there are these characteristics of systemic health. Every system has it. So every system has a level of adaptability, a level of clarity to it, connectivity, and directionality. When we were coming up with these, part of it was informed by systems dynamics literature to really start to understand, we're talking about not complicated systems, we're talking about complex systems that are ever changing, they're super dynamic, they're influencing each other in all these different ways that we can't even begin to totally grapple with. So we wanted the indicators to really reflect that dynamism. And so that's where that helps in terms of that goal setting. So everything kind of comes back from that. And it comes back from this whole idea of saying, if you're looking at, at that company portfolio level, there's going to be those characteristics around impact and ESG that are just going to be built into it, right? But in understanding, but how have you taken that action, that investment, that example, that, innovation, and how is that beginning to essentially get brought into a broader ecosystem of the entire financial system? So how is this getting socialized? And there's all these studies around kind of the science of adoption and how this kind of takes hold and getting to these thresholds of awareness and action. And only then can you start to connect it to these broader kind of macro indicator sets that, to your point, really only start to show that progress over time. But it's there. And so it's just a matter of how do we start to connect these 3 layers more concretely, so that if you're using indicators from Iris Plus, or you're borrowing from GRI or ISSB or whatever, how can you make that understanding to know we are creating X amount of jobs, it's aligned with SDG whatever, of ending poverty, but at the end of the day, it's but have you moved the needle? Has that actually changed? That's what we're trying to get to. No one's answered it perfectly yet. So it's anybody that's looking to get in this industry, they should really go into that area of it.
Oh, no, that's good to know. Well, finally, before we let you go, I wanted to ask, there's a lot of people in the sustainability world, CSOs, and you've got people we know, who are there to make a difference and see this and buy this. And it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. You've got to think of this, the whole system when you're investing and integrate that into your process. But what advice would you give those sustainability professionals who want to integrate this into what they do, systems level investing, but need the executive buy-in, to convince the board, to convince management that this is the path they need to take? How do they start that discussion?
Yeah, especially given the amount of people this will require, right? When you talk about engagement, on 8 teams were involved on focusing. So I really want to know too.
Yeah, it gets to a change of culture, really.
Yeah. Well, so first question. This is what we do in a lot of these different trustee meetings and things like that. First question is, do you think that there's do you think the risks of today are different from the risks of yesterday? Basically saying, coded a different way, do you think there's a difference between idiosyncratic risk and systemic risk? Now, if you're talking to the right leadership, if you're talking to the investment committee, if you're talking to a CIO, they will absolutely say, yes, there is a difference. And then you ask, okay, do you think diversification alone is equipped to handle these risks? In particular, systemic risks. And as you know, with systemic risk, there's nowhere to hide. Diversification can't actually manage it. So it's like fluoride in the water. Once you've introduced that, then it's do you think that you need a different set of tools and a different way of thinking to ultimately drive this? And if you get yeses, you've done it, right? And it's not just the millennial that's on the board that's going to be excited. It is amazing how when you start to take the board of a pension, you have folks that are really, sophisticated financial actors. You have folks that represent what the pension is managing, right? Teachers and other units, right? And so it's just that thing, like other aspects of this, like people will come in, they will inform it, they'll get excited about different dimensions, but all of it comes together in this way that ultimately creates this more resilient focus, this more resilient direction for the institution.
It makes a lot of sense. Put them on the decisions. You just ask the right questions and give them the tools.
Always ask questions, because that's the thing. Like it's a very, because there's always going to be the folks that come into it where they've made up their mind, right? And just those really high level questions, it's like something clicks on when you ask it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, Bill, thanks for joining us today. If anyone is interested in reaching out to any of us, we're all available on LinkedIn and social media. I suggest you guys check out the Investment Integration Project, TIIP, and see more about what Bill and Steve and the team are doing. If you want to find more about ED4S, you can find us at ed4s.org. Thanks again for joining us, and take care, everybody.